Hi, welcome back to the Photoshop training channel. I'm Jesus Ramirez. In this video, I'm going to show you 19 Photoshop tips, tricks, and hacks that you probably don't know. My goal for this video is to show you new techniques that will help you in your workflow, projects, and productivity. Before we get started, I would like to ask you for two favors. If you see a tip that you like, and it will help you create better images, then hit that like button as soon as you see it, and let me know in the comments what tip that was. And the second favor is for those of you who are watching the Photoshop training channel for the first time. If you find this video useful, then hit that subscribe and notification buttons. All right, let's get started. In this first tip, I'm going to show you how to open the same document in two windows, but most importantly, why that is so valuable. So I have this photo of this dog, and I can open it up in another window by going into Window, Arrange, and selecting New Window 4 in the name of the file. This file is titled dog.psd. If I click on that, it opens up in a new window. So now I have the same document in two windows. This is not a duplicate, it's exactly the same document. And I can go into Window, Arrange, and select either 2 up horizontal or 2 up vertical. I'll select 2 up vertical and put the documents side by side. So with one document, I can zoom in and work on the details. And with the second document, I can zoom out and see the overall image. Then I can create any adjustment that I like. So in this case, I'll create a new layer and I'll start using the clone stamp tool to clone this woman out. So I'm going to hold Alt, Option on the Mac and click, and I'll start painting her away. Notice how in the left window, I'm working on the details, and on the document on the right, I can see how those adjustments are affecting the overall image. So this is a great way of working when you're retouching because you don't have to zoom in to work on a detail and then zoom out to see how that detail affected the overall image. So just zoom in, work on your image, see how that adjustment affects the overall image, and then continue adjusting as you see fit. Also, when you're in this view, if you hold Shift and the spacebar to pan, you can pan on both documents at the same time by holding Shift and the spacebar. This feature could also be very powerful if you have two monitors because you can drag one tab over onto your second monitor. In this next tip, I'm going to show you how to select colors from any application. Let me show you what I mean by that. You probably already know that if you select the eyedropper tool, you can of course click and drag and select the color. So I can hover over this green and release, and that color is now my foreground color. And of course, I can paint with that color. But did you know that you can select the eyedropper tool, then minimize Photoshop? So I have a second window over here, which happens to be my Instagram account. In case you're interested, I'm at JR from PTC. And I can just select any color that I like from this different application by putting it next to the Photoshop window frame, clicking inside of Photoshop, and then dragging it outside. Notice now how I'm selecting the brown color from the leaf, or I can select the red from the Adobe logo, or any other color that I hover over, including the blue on my desktop. You'll notice how the foreground color swatch changes colors as I hover over the applications that are outside of Photoshop when you select it. When you select the color, you can of course come back into Photoshop, and with the brush tool selected, I can paint with that color that I selected from outside of Photoshop. In this next Photoshop tip, I'm going to show you how to make the clone stamp tool even more powerful. So you probably already know about the clone stamp tool. It's here. When you select it, you can hold Alt, Option on the Mac, and click on a sample source, and then you can click and drag, ideally in a new layer. So I'll create a new layer and click and drag to paint new pixels. So now she has a twin. But what you probably didn't know are the powerful keyboard shortcuts that you can use. So once again, I'm going to hold Alt, Option on the Mac to sample from her shoe. You can see the preview here on the brush. And watch what happens when I hold Alt, Shift, and the greater than, less than keys. That's the comma and period keys. Notice how I can rotate the clone source. Notice how her shoe is rotating. So when I paint, I can now paint her in an angle. I can also hold Alt, Option on the Mac, and click on that same shoe, and I'm going to rotate her back by holding Alt, Shift, and the less than key, and it rotates her again the other way. But what I can now also do is hold Alt, Shift, and the right and left bracket key on the keyboard to scale the source. So now notice how her shoe is getting smaller. When I paint, I'm now going to paint a smaller version of that. So you can scale and rotate the clone source by using those keyboard shortcuts. And by the way, I should make a disclaimer. This only works with the North American keyboards. So in some parts of the world, this keyboard shortcut will not work. If you're in a region where those keyboard shortcuts do not work, don't worry about it. There is a panel that you can use. So I'm going to go into Window and select Clone Source, and you have that panel here. So when you make a selection, again, her shoe, you can see the preview. Notice how I can rotate the source here. See that? See how you can see the sample rotating there? And I can also scale it from this panel. And then I can, of course, paint those pixels in. So remember, you can use the clone source panel to rotate and scale the clone stamp tool. But it's a good idea to remember the keyboard shortcuts because when you're painting, that can be a little faster. In this next Photoshop tip, I'm going to show you a powerful compositing trick with blending modes. So you may be working in a composite. Obviously, composites can include more than one layer. So we have this foreground, which is a model, and all these adjustment layers that help it make it seem as if she's fitting into the background. And by the way, if you're wondering how these were created, I also have a tutorial on compositing. I'll place the link right below in the description. But anyway, so we have this composite here. And if I change my mind and decide that I need a second model, so I'll press Ctrl-J, Command-J on the Mac to duplicate, and I decide to move her over, maybe she has a twin, now I have to apply all these different adjustments to the second model to make it more realistic. There's basically two ways I can do that. I can select them all, press Ctrl-J, Command-J on the Mac, and duplicate those layers and bring them down. Then press Ctrl-Alt-G, Command-Option-G on the Mac to create a clipping mask. But you can already see the problem. I'm having way too many layers just to control these two models. So that's not an efficient way of working. I'll delete those layers by pressing the Delete key. The other option, of course, is to hold Ctrl-Shift and click on both layer thumbnails to load them as a selection, and then apply that selection as a layer mask. But then we have another problem. We have to duplicate that layer mask 2 more times, and we don't have the flexibility of moving our model because the layer mask will no longer match the models. So we also want the flexibility to be able to move our layers around. And one of the easiest ways of resolving this problem is by putting everything into a group. So I'm going to click on the topmost layer, hold Shift and click on the bottom portrait layer, then press Ctrl-G, Command-G on the Mac to put all those layers into a group. Then I'll open up that group and I'll remove the clipping mask. Notice how these 3 adjustment layers are clipped to this layer. These down pointing arrows are indicating that their visibility is affected by this layer. So if I simply hold Alt, hover over in between the layers and click, I break that link. Now I can simply go into the group and I can just go into the normal mode and notice now that these layers, these adjustment layers, only affect the models and not the background. I know it was a little difficult to see because the color adjustments were trying to match the background color. So what I'll do, just to make it obvious, is going back into pass-through and I'll just make an extreme adjustment with a different adjustment layers. So I'll make a very extreme adjustment, then I'll go back into the group and change the blending mode to normal. Notice now that the adjustment layers are only affecting the contents of the group, and no matter where I place the contents or how many layers we have, I can press Ctrl-J, Command-J on the Mac to duplicate. The adjustment layers will only affect. Layers will only affect the contents of the group and nothing else. So this is a fantastic trick that you can use to keep things more organized when you're compositing in Photoshop. In this next Photoshop tip, I'm going to show you the power of the 8 special blending modes. The 8 blending modes that are highlighted on this graphic give you more options on blending than all the other blending modes. And let me show you what I mean by that. I have this composite, which is basically a background and a foreground, and it's trying to replicate a window reflection effect. And if I wanted to add a specular highlight to the scene, I can click on the top layer, create a new layer, then with a brush, I could paint with white. This is going to become my specular highlight. Then I can select the blending mode that'll make it seem as if that was a bright light. One of those blending modes is color dodge. One of the differences between the 8 special blending modes and the rest of the blending modes is that the opacity reacts different than fill. See that? You can see it here on the edges above her shoulder. Notice how yellow it becomes above her shoulders with fill. Now watch what happens with opacity. You don't get that same effect. With all the other blending modes not highlighted in yellow, opacity and fill give you the same result. With the blending modes highlighted in yellow, you get different results when you adjust fill compared to opacity. That is one of the differences. The second difference, and the point of this tip, is that you can double click on the layer and you can also get an extra level of blending by unchecking Transparency Shapes Layers. Watch what happens. See that? That's with Transparency Shapes Layers checked, and this is without. Notice how now it looks like a much brighter highlight right on that window, and I can adjust the fill to control the intensity, and I can press OK, click on the move tool, and move that, and it looks like a bright highlight hitting that window no matter where I move it. So this is a great technique for creating specular highlights when you're compositing in Photoshop. Also, keep in mind that you can do the same thing with these blending modes, so try them out and see how they can help you improve your projects. In this next tip, I'm going to show you a really cool tip to change the luminosity of your images. You may already know that if you create a new black and white adjustment layer, your image would turn, of course, black and white. Then you can adjust these sliders to control the luminosity of the layers. Essentially, you're taking the original color and making it darker or brighter in this black and white version. For example, this building is yellow, so if I adjust the yellow slider, that building gets darker or brighter because those pixels were originally yellow. But that you know that if you change the blending mode from normal to luminosity, you keep the colors and you can change the luminosity using these sliders. So I'll reset the adjustment layer. Notice what happens when I adjust the reds. The original reds get darker and brighter. Same thing with the yellows, greens, cyans, blues, and magentas. So this is a fantastic trick that you can use to change the luminance values of your image. In this next Photoshop tip, I'm going to show you how you can supercharge the spot healing brush tool to give you much better results when you're retouching portraits. So this is the spot healing brush tool here. Select it and create a new layer and make sure that sample all layers is checked. That way we can work non-destructively. You always want to work non-destructively because sometimes you may make mistakes and you want to have the flexibility to come and make changes or delete the adjustments. So you may already know that with the spot healing brush tool, you can click and drag to remove wrinkles and blemishes. It's before and after. And in some cases, it does a great job. However, in other more problematic areas, like in this area here, if I were to try to remove those blemishes, Photoshop will introduce problem areas instead of fixing them. See that? See how we created this dark patch here? And if I try to remove more blemishes, it really doesn't do that good of a job. And that's because we're not really targeting anything. So it's always a good idea to think of your blemish and then target that blemish. And what I mean by that is you have to look at the blemish and think, is it darker or brighter than the skin tone? If it's darker than the skin tone, like in this case, then you want to lighten that blemish. So you can go into mode and select lighten. If the blemish was brighter than the skin tone, then you want to darken it. But in this case, it's darker than the skin tone, so we want to lighten it. So when you select lighten and you start painting on those blemishes, you're only targeting the darker blemishes and not affecting the brighter pixels. So you can remove those dark blemishes in these areas and not affect those tiny little hairs on his forehead because we're only targeting the darker pixels and those strands of hair are bright. So I can come in here and just remove all these blemishes without affecting the detail that we want to keep. In some cases, like in this area here, we can remove the blemish, but we still keep the dead skin because the dead skin is brighter than the skin tone. So in that case, I would have to change the mode to darken and then paint to get rid of those brighter pixels. Also, notice that when I have lighten selected and I paint over this wrinkle, the darker pixels disappear. Disappear, but we still keep the brighter pixels. We still keep that texture and that detail, and that could be very powerful when you're retouching your portraits. In this next Photoshop tip, I'm going to show you how to turn a blend if blend into transparency. So I have this text layer and this layer, which is a rust texture. If I press Ctrl Alt G, Command Option G on the Mac, I can of course clip that to the layer below, and now I have this realistic looking rust layer. But if I wanted to only keep the rusty, darker areas of this texture, I would need to mask them out, or in this case, use a better technique known as blend if. So I could double click to the side of the layer, and if you don't know what blend if is, I highly recommend watching my crash course on blend if. It explains everything. I'll place a link right below in the description. But blend if basically allows you to blend layers based on luminosity or their channels. So right now I'm going to work with the grays, which is luminosity, and on this layer, the layer that I have selected, I can hide the dark pixels or I can hide the bright pixels. So if I hide the bright pixels, the original green comes back and the darker areas remain, which is what I want. When I press OK, you'll notice now that my texture looks exactly the way that I want it. Now, the problem is that this is not real transparency. Look at the layer thumbnail here. You can still see the entire layer. There's no transparency. If I hold Control, Command on the Mac, and click on that layer, notice how I load the entire canvas and not those pixels. If you need transparency, meaning these pixels to be selectable, all you need to do is right-click on the layer and select Convert to Smart Object. Notice the layer thumbnail now. We actually have transparency. So if I press Control, Command on the Mac, and click, notice how I'm now selecting the transparent pixels. So I can create a curves adjustment layer and only target those pixels. Obviously, I can create a clipping mask and then make an adjustment to only those pixels. So this is a really powerful technique to get transparency out of blend if. In Photoshop CC, the Refine Edge dialog box was replaced by Selected Mask. Let me click and drag on this dog and just make a quick selection. So with any selection active in Photoshop CC, you can click on Selected Mask, and this brings up the Select and Mask workspace, and you can adjust these sliders to control how the mask looks. Some people don't like this new workspace and they prefer the old one. The problem is that they don't know how to get back to it. And this is what this tip is all about, how to get back to the old dialog box in case you prefer it. If you prefer the old dialog box, hold Shift when you have a selection or a mask active, then go into Select and click on Selected Mask. Remember, you have to be holding Shift when you do that. If you do, the old Refine Mask dialog box comes up and you can use that instead of the new Selected Mask workspace. In this next Photoshop trick, I'm going to show you a technique to create non-destructive masks. Let me show you what I mean by that. In this image, I have this background layer, this gradient map is applying this color effect, this rectangle, and this text layer. If I wanted the word winter to cut through and show the background with the effect, instinctively, most people would think to create a layer mask out of the text. So hold Control, click on the layer thumbnail, and then create a layer mask on the rectangle layer while holding Alt, Option on the Mac, to create an inverted layer mask. And that does give us the result that we want. We have the cutout text showing us the background. Unfortunately, doing this will not be the most effective way in some cases because the layer mask is technically destructive. We can't edit the word winter. So if we wanted to type the word snow instead of winter, then we would have to do that whole process all over again. Obviously, in this case, this is a very simple thing to do, but in some projects, this could be a much more complicated task. So let me delete this layer and show you what to do instead. So I have the knockout layer, which reads winter, and I'm going to hold Shift and click on this gradient map. Then I'm going to press Ctrl G, Command G on the Mac to put that into a group. I'm going to open the group and double click to the side of the knockout layer to bring up the layer style window. From this dialog box, under Advanced Blending, I'm going to select Shallow, and nothing will happen. But watch what happens when I reduce the fill opacity to 0. Notice now how we're cutting through to the background. I'm going to press OK. Now I can double click on the layer and type the word snow. But you will notice a problem, that we don't actually have the color effect. Well, the reason that we don't have the color effect on the word snow is because the gradient layer is actually inside of the group. So if we simply click and drag it out of the group, notice now that the effect is applied to the word snow. And the reason I did that was just to show you that anything that is inside of this group 1 will be cut out by the knockout. So anything below the knockout will be masked out. Essentially, this layer is knocking out a hole through anything inside of this group to reveal what's outside of it. And like I said, the best thing about this is that it's non-destructive, so you can always come back and edit it if you need to. In this next Photoshop tip, I'm going to show you a powerful technique to create selections. A lot of times when you're working in Photoshop, you may need to target only the shadows or the highlights of an image. So if we were to create a curves adjustment layer and we only wanted to target the shadows, then it could be a little difficult to do. So you can use a layer mask to just select the shadows. And how do you do that? Well, I'm going to delete the layer mask and I'm going to first show you a keyboard shortcut that allows you to select the bright pixels. So if I press Ctrl Alt and the number 2, that loads the bright pixels as a selection. Ctrl Alt 2, Command Option 2 on the Mac. Then if I create a layer mask and hold Alt Option on the Mac and click, you can see what that layer mask looks like. The bright pixels are selected, which is why they're bright, and the dark pixels are not, which is why they're black. So now I can make an adjustment that only targets the bright pixels. But if I wanted to select only the darker pixels, I can then just click on Invert, and then this will allow me to target only the darker pixels of the image. Notice how I was able to make these darker pixels on the outside much darker, making her much brighter and stand out before and after. Also, this is a bonus tip. When you make an adjustment intended to be a luminosity adjustment, you should always change the blending mode. And let me show you why. I'm going to make an extreme adjustment so that you could see. So I made this extreme adjustment with the curves adjustment layer, and my intention was to change the luminosity of the layer, not the saturation and not the color. But when I zoom in, you'll see that I also changed the saturation. See that? Before and after. I changed the saturation. If you want to only target the luminance values and not the saturation, change the blending mode to luminosity. See that? Luminosity only changes the luminance values. With normal, you also add saturation. So change the luminosity and then make your adjustments. So I'll reset the layer and I'll make the adjustment like I did before, and that looks much better because I didn't adjust the saturation of the image, only the luminance values. In this next tip, I'm going to show you how to change Photoshop's auto color correction algorithm to give you better results. So we have this image here that obviously has a color cast, and you can use the curves adjustment layer or the levels adjustment layer to fix this image. So I'll select curves because that's the adjustment layer that I prefer, and I can click on Auto to allow Photoshop to attempt to automatically fix the image. In this case, Photoshop didn't do that good of a job, but you can make a change to the algorithm that Photoshop uses. You can go into the flyout menu and select Auto Options, which brings up this window, which contains the 4 different algorithms that Photoshop can use to attempt to auto color correct this image. By default, Enhance Brightness and Contrast is selected, but you can select some of the other algorithms to see if they give you better results. I prefer Find Dark and Light Colors. Notice how this algorithm gives you a better result. You can also check Snap Neutral Midtones to try to find a neutral gray, and notice how this makes the image much better. Then you can click on Save as Defaults so that Photoshop remembers these settings and it applies them every time you click on that auto button. You can press OK, and next time that you create a curves adjustment layer, Photoshop will use that algorithm when you click on the auto button. Notice that that's much better than the default algorithm. I'm also going to show you what to do when this algorithm doesn't work. I also have a color cast in this image, and I'm going to create a curves adjustment layer and click on Auto. This time the image looks a little bit better, but it's not quite what we're looking for. If this happens, all you need to do is click on the gray point eyedropper and click anywhere on the image that should be a neutral gray, for example, the brick path, and when you do that, Photoshop neutralizes the image and the image looks much better. Now, I know that some of you may be thinking, why don't we do that from the beginning? Let me show you what happens when you do that. I can click on this reset button. I still have the gray point eyedropper selected, and if I click on the brick path, the image does look much better, it's neutralized, but it doesn't have the contrast because we didn't apply that auto color correction algorithm. So it's much better to first try the auto color correction algorithm. If it doesn't work, use the gray point eyedropper and click on something that should be a neutral gray, the brick path, or maybe even a dark gray on her strap to color correct the image. But I think that in this case, the brick path works better. In this Photoshop tip, I'm going to show you another great use for the auto color correction options in both curves and levels. In this case, instead of color correcting an image, we're going to color match an image. In compositing, one of the greatest challenges to making things look realistic is getting both images to have the same color theme or the same color temperature. But with the curves adjustment layer and auto options, you can make that task a whole lot easier. Let me show you how to do that. I'm working with 2 layers here. I have this background layer, which is cold and it has a cool color cast in this model that was shot in a studio. I've already masked her out. If I hold shift and click on her layer, you can see the background is just simply a white background. And if we wanted to make this composite more realistic, we have to color match the images. So one way of doing that is by creating the curves adjustment layer, clipping it to the layer below by clicking on this icon. This simply means that the visibility of the model layer will control the effects of the curves adjustment layer. In other words, anything that we apply on this curves adjustment layer will only affect the model and not the background. And before you do anything else, you have to make sure that the focus, this white outline, is on the curves thumbnail, not the layer mask. So make sure you have this white outline here. Then hold Alt, Option on the Mac, and click on Auto. That also brings up the auto color correction options. One important thing is that you have to make sure that you uncheck Snap Neutral Midtones. Now you have to tell Photoshop what color the shadows are and what color the highlights are. So you can click on shadows and the color picker opens up and just click a dark area in your image. You may need to click and drag to make it darker or brighter depending on what color you select. So I'm just going to select a darker blue, which is close to the color that I selected, and then press OK. I'll do the same thing for the highlights. I'll click on highlights and then click on a highlight color. In this case, maybe I'll click on the white on the flag here, and that might be a little dark, so I'll click and drag up to brighten it up just a little bit. And that applies those colors onto this image. Then I can press OK and press no. In most cases, you do not want to make these your default colors. Then I can use the curves to adjust the luminosity of the foreground to match the background. The black point controls the darkest pixels. The white point controls the brightest pixels. The curves is actually really simple to understand. If you click and drag up, you add light to make things brighter. If you click and drag down, you reduce light to make things darker, much like a dimmer switch. So what I'm going to do now is just click here and drag down to add a little bit of contrast. And I'm going to click and drag this point up because I don't want the darkest pixel on her layer to be completely black. Notice that there's no real pure black in the background, so I don't want there to be any pure black in the foreground as well. So maybe right along here. And then I can click and drag this point up to make the highlights brighter. And that alone makes this composite much more realistic. Of course, you can keep fine-tuning the image, but these are the basic steps to color matching images in Photoshop with this fantastic technique. In this next tip, I'm going to show you how to create a Photoshop template. Most people don't even know about this technique, but it's a really useful and valuable technique. So you may work on a file that will become a template. For example, in this case, I created a file that is used to create seamless panoramas on Instagram. And just in case you don't know what I'm talking about, this is what it looks like. I actually have a full-length tutorial on how to make this template, so you can watch that if you like to. I'll place a link down below in the description. But anyway, this is the file that I worked on, and it doesn't matter what the template that you're creating is going to be used for. The point is that you have a file that is going to be reused over and over again, right? So after you create your file, like this one here, of course you will save it. File, save, and then I'll save this on my desktop, and I'll just call it Instagram template. And then press OK. If I go onto my desktop, you will see the template file here. It's a regular .psd, a Photoshop file. If I double click on it, of course it will open up in Photoshop. It was already open, but notice the tab. It reads Instagram template.psd, the name of the file. If I'm working with my template and I make a change, for example, crop it and close my file and save it, when I open my template again, it will not be the template as I wanted because I made a change. In order to avoid that, you can turn this file into a Photoshop template file. And let me show you how to do that. I'm going to press Ctrl Z to undo that last change. I'm going to close this file. Then I'm going to go back into the desktop and I'm going to right click on the file, click on rename. And all I'm going to do is add one character after the file type. I'm going to add the character T, PSDT, Photoshop template. Then when I accept the changes, my operating system will ask me if I want to make the change. Yes, I do. So I'm going to click on yes. And now this has become a Photoshop template file. When I double click on this PSDT, it will open up in Photoshop as you would expect. But notice one thing. It no longer reads the file type. It reads untitled 1. So what Photoshop is doing is opening up a separate instance of that file. So that way, you never override the original template and you always work with a separate instance. If you want to override your template and make an adjustment to it, all you need to do is go back into that PSDT file, right-click, rename, and remove that T so that it's a PSD once again. I will change the file type, click on yes. If I double-click on the file, notice that it reads Instagram-template.psd. And of course, if I were to make a change now, it would override the template. So remember, adding a T after PSD would turn the Photoshop file into a template file. And by the way, this only works with Photoshop CC 2015.5 and newer. In this next Photoshop tip, I'm going to show you how to match image sizes using a little known option in the crop tool. So with the crop tool selected, you can click on this drop down and you'll see an option that you probably have never noticed before, which is the front image. So when you click on that, nothing really happens. But Photoshop has analyzed this image, the currently selected image, and it has noticed that it's 1000 pixels by 1000 pixels at a resolution of 300. So that is what Photoshop is going to remember. If I go into another image like this one here, Photoshop already has that crop overlay active, and no matter where I crop my image or how I crop my image, when I commit the changes, Photoshop will turn my crop into that same image size and resolution, 1000 pixels by 1000 pixels at a resolution of 300. Notice that if I click and drag with the rectangular marquee tool, this is a 1000 pixel by 1000 pixel image. I'm going to press Ctrl D, Command D to deselect. If I click on the crop tool again, it still remembers those settings. And no matter how small my crop gets, the image will always be that large. I'll double click on the hand tool to fit the image to screen. Obviously, the image is pixelated because we enlarge the image to match that crop size. So remember, when you want to match image sizes, select the crop tool and then go under front image to copy the